The envelope had been hidden beneath the cracked altar for decades. Eleanor Whitmore held it beneath the lantern, her hands covered in dust and blood from a cut across her palm. On its yellowed surface, someone had written 7 words. The land was never theirs. Above her, a floorboard creaked. Then someone began pulling on the rope that was her only way out. 3 weeks earlier, Eleanor had owned nothing but one suitcase, an old wool coat, and $317. At 61, she stood beneath a gray October sky and watched strangers carry the remains of her marriage onto the sidewalk. A faded armchair, Thomas's wooden workbench, the walnut clock he had always promised to repair. Each piece had been marked with a price. Thomas had died 6 months earlier after a sudden illness. Eleanor had believed losing her husband of 37 years would be the hardest thing she would ever face. Then came the hospital bills, the collection notices, and finally the letter informing her that the house where they had raised their daughter no longer belonged to her. Claire had asked Eleanor to move into her small apartment 2 states away, but Claire already had 2 children, too little space and problems of her own. Eleanor could not bear to arrive carrying grief, debt, and another mouth to feed. So she bought a bus ticket to the end of the line. Near sunset, the bus stopped in Bellwether, a farming town that looked as though it had been slowly abandoned while no one was watching. The textile mill had closed years ago. Half the stores on Main Street were boarded shut. The town clock had stopped at 2:17, and no one seemed interested in repairing it. Eleanor rented a narrow room above a laundromat. The following morning, she sat alone in a diner, warming her hands around weak coffee, when she noticed a handwritten announcement beside the register. County auction, abandoned and tax-delinquent properties. At the bottom of the page was a property without a photograph. Former St. Agnes Church. Opening bid, $300. The waitress followed Eleanor's gaze. You don't want that place. Why not? The roof leaks. The windows are broken. Part of the floor may already be gone. Then why hasn't anyone bought it? The waitress lowered her voice. Because people in Bellwether stopped going near it 30 years ago. That afternoon, Eleanor walked beyond the last row of houses. She found St. Agnes behind dead vines and weeds reaching her waist. Its steeple leaned against the darkening sky. Black boards covered its windows, and a deep crack divided the stone steps. The church looked wounded. So did she. Eleanor placed her hand against the locked wooden door. For the first time since Thomas died, she did not feel like she was standing at the end of something. She felt as though something on the other side was waiting for her. The county auction was held 3 days later in a drafty meeting room above the Bellwether fire station. Eleanor arrived early, carrying the dented biscuit tin inside her handbag. Most of the people gathered there were local contractors, farmers looking for cheap acreage, and investors hoping to buy abandoned buildings for almost nothing. When the auctioneer reached the former St. Agnes Church, the room fell strangely quiet. Opening bid, $300. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer glanced around. 300. Anyone? A man near the back laughed under his breath. You'd have to pay me to take it. Several people smiled, but Eleanor did not. She raised her bidder card. The room turned toward her. 300 from the lady in front, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 350? Silence. A few seconds later, the hammer struck the table. Sold. Eleanor had spent almost everything she had on a building she had never entered. By noon, half the town seemed to know. At the diner, conversations stopped when she walked in. At the hardware store, the owner stared at her deed before quietly asking whether she understood what she had purchased. It's a church, Eleanor said. It was a church, he corrected. Now it's rot, mold, and unpaid history. He sold her a hammer, a lantern, work gloves, and the cheapest box of nails he had. Before she left, he added a small pry bar without charging her. You'll need this more than the nails. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to St. Agnes. The county clerk had given her one rusted key, but it snapped inside the lock. She finally forced the side door open with her shoulder. A heavy smell of damp wood and dust rolled toward her. Sunlight entered through gaps in the boarded windows, cutting pale lines through the darkness. Broken pews leaned against one another. Plaster had fallen from the walls. Dead leaves covered the aisle, though every door had supposedly been sealed for years. At the far end stood the altar. It was carved from dark wood and white stone, but a jagged crack divided its center. One corner had sunk lower than the other, as if the floor beneath it had shifted. Eleanor stepped closer. Someone had scratched a small cross into the wood near the base. Below it were 3 words: "Do not remove stone." She read the warning twice. Then a sound came from beneath the altar. A soft, hollow knock. Eleanor froze. For several seconds the church was silent. Then the sound came again. Eleanor did not move. The sound beneath the altar was too soft to be an animal scratching, and too deliberate to be falling plaster. Knock. A pause. Then another knock. She lifted the lantern and stepped closer. The crack running through the white stone was wider near the base. Dust had gathered along most of its edges, but one section looked strangely clean, as if something had rubbed against it recently. Eleanor knelt carefully. The warning carved into the wood, "Do not remove stone," was old, but the scratches surrounding it were not. Fresh pale lines cut through the dark finish. Someone had tried to pry the lower panel open. She ran her gloved fingers over the marks. There were at least 4 separate grooves. Not the damage of time. Tool marks. A cold draft touched her cheek. Eleanor turned toward the broken windows, but the air inside the church was still. The draft came again, rising from the narrow gap beneath the altar. There was empty space below it. She placed the lantern on the floor and tapped the stone with the handle of her hammer. The left side answered with a dull thud. The center sounded solid. The right corner produced a hollow echo. Eleanor tapped again. Hollow. Whatever lay beneath the altar was larger than a simple crack in the foundation. She took the pry bar from her bag but hesitated before placing it against the stone. The warning seemed to stare back at her. For a moment, she imagined Thomas beside her, smiling at the way she always opened drawers marked private and doors marked keep out. "You were never good at leaving mysteries alone," he would have said. The memory made her smile, but only briefly. As Eleanor leaned closer, she noticed something else. Small pieces of gray mortar scattered beneath the altar. They were lighter than the crumbling plaster around the church. Newer. Someone had sealed part of the structure long after the church was built. Before she could examine it further, a floorboard creaked behind her. Eleanor turned sharply. No one was there. The aisle stretched empty toward the open side door. Then she saw muddy footprints on the dusty floor. They began near the entrance, crossed between the broken pews, and stopped several feet behind her. They were not hers. Eleanor rose slowly and gripped the hammer. "Who's there?" Silence. Outside, dead branches scraped against the stone walls. She followed the footprints to the doorway, but they vanished on the wet grass. When Eleanor looked back toward the altar, the lantern flame trembled, and from beneath the cracked stone came one final sound. Not a knock this time. A faint metallic scrape. Eleanor returned to the church the next morning carrying a stronger lantern, a coil of rope, and the pry bar from the hardware store. The muddy footprints were gone. Rain had entered through the broken windows during the night, washing parts of the floor clean. Still, the marks around the altar remained, along with the thin gap where cold air rose from beneath the stone. Eleanor had just knelt to examine it when a voice came from the doorway. "You should leave that alone." She turned. An elderly man stood beneath the crooked doorframe. He wore a stained canvas coat and leaned on a shovel polished smooth by years of use. His face was narrow, deeply lined, and familiar in the way of someone who had spent his entire life in one place. "I own the building," Eleanor said. Ownership and understanding are not the same thing. He introduced himself as Samuel Pike, caretaker of the cemetery behind St. Agnes. His father had held the same job before him, and his grandfather before that. Samuel's gaze moved toward the cracked altar. "You heard something under it, didn't you?" Eleanor tightened her grip on the lantern. "How did you know?" "Because others heard it too." Samuel stepped inside, but he refused to cross the final row of pews. He told Eleanor that St. Agnes had closed nearly 30 years earlier after a fire damaged the eastern wall. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but Samuel remembered men arriving before sunrise to remove boxes from the church. A week later, the minister disappeared. Some said he had stolen money. Others believed he had discovered something involving land records and families powerful enough to silence him. "What does that have to do with the altar?" Eleanor asked. Samuel looked toward the warning carved into the wood. "After the fire, workers came from outside town. They repaired nothing except that stone. My father watched them seal it. He said they carried cement in and left with empty hands." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Did anyone ever open it?" "Not successfully." Samuel explained that 2 young men had tried years later. One broke his wrist when the stone shifted. The other left Bellwether the following morning and never returned. Eleanor studied his face. "You believe the church is cursed?" "No," Samuel said quietly. "Curses are easier. People know to fear them." He walked back toward the doorway. What's under that altar was hidden by men, not spirits. And men usually bury things for one of 2 reasons: to protect them or to make sure the truth never reaches daylight. Before leaving, Samuel paused. "If you open it, Mrs. Whitmore, be certain you are prepared for someone else to want it closed again." The storm arrived just after midnight. Rain hammered the roof of St. Agnes, pouring through missing shingles and broken panes. Eleanor had been sleeping on a narrow cot near the old vestry when a heavy crack shook the church. She woke beneath a shower of dust. For several seconds, she could hear only the wind and the frantic beating of rain against the walls. Then came the sound of stone grinding across stone. Eleanor grabbed the lantern and hurried toward the altar. A section of the floor had collapsed. The right corner of the cracked altar had sunk several inches, exposing a dark opening beneath the white stone. Loose mortar and broken boards had fallen into the gap. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of wet earth and rusted metal. Eleanor remembered Samuel's warning. She also remembered Thomas telling her that fear often sounded most convincing just before a person discovered the truth. She tied one end of the rope around a pew, tested the knot twice, and lowered herself through the opening. The space beneath the altar was not a grave. It was a narrow brick chamber, barely tall enough for her to stand. Water trickled down one wall. The ceiling was supported by thick beams blackened by smoke. On the far side stood a small iron door. Its lock had already been broken. Eleanor raised the lantern and saw fresh scratches around the latch, the same kind of marks she had found above. Someone had tried to enter the chamber recently. She pulled the door open. Inside was a metal box wrapped in rotting cloth. It was too heavy to lift easily. Eleanor dragged it across the damp floor until it rested beneath the opening. The scraping sound echoed through the chamber, the same sound she had heard from above. For one uneasy moment, she wondered whether someone had moved the box before her. She forced the rusted clasps apart with the pry bar. There was no gold inside, no jewelry, no church silver. Instead, Eleanor found several leather-bound ledgers, bundles of yellowed letters, and a hand-drawn map marked with blue lines, stone symbols, and family names she recognized from storefronts around Bellwether. Beneath them lay a sealed envelope. Written across the front were the words, "To the person who finds this, the land was never theirs." Eleanor unfolded the largest map across her knees. It showed St. Agnes at the center of a network of wells, orchards, and narrow waterways extending beneath the town. Several parcels had been circled in red. One name appeared beside nearly every one of them: Vale. Above Eleanor, a floorboard creaked. Then someone began pulling on the rope. The rope jerked upward. Eleanor grabbed it with both hands. "Who's there?" No answer came from above. The rope pulled again, harder this time, dragging her toward the opening. Eleanor wrapped one arm around a support beam and held on. The lantern swung beside her, throwing wild shadows across the brick chamber. Then the rope went slack. A man's polished black shoe appeared at the edge of the opening. Eleanor looked up. Victor Vale stood above her. He stared at the open metal box, then at the papers spread across the floor. "You should not have come down there," he said. Before Eleanor could answer, footsteps thundered through the church. Samuel appeared behind Victor, carrying his shovel. "Step away from the opening." Victor turned slowly. "This does not concern you, Pike. It concerned my family long before yours learned how to steal with a pen." For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Victor stepped back. "This building is unsafe," he said. "Whatever she found belongs to the county." He left without looking at Eleanor again. Samuel lowered himself into the chamber. "You're hurt. I'm alive." Together, they moved the box away from the opening and examined its contents. The first ledger contained the names of Bellwether's original landowners. Beside each name were parcels marked for public use. The church, the orchard, the wells. Shelters for widows, laborers, and children with nowhere else to go. "This land was never supposed to be sold," Eleanor said. Samuel opened a second ledger. The later entries were different. Boundary lines had been changed. Tax debts appeared beside families who had paid on time. Several transfers carried signatures dated years after the supposed owners had died. One name appeared again and again. Vale. Samuel's hands trembled. "My grandfather lost his orchard after the drought of 1962. The county told him the land had always belonged to them." Eleanor unfolded the largest map. Blue lines ran from the hill behind St. Agnes toward Old Wells, farms and houses across Bellwether. Small stone symbols marked their path. "It's a water system," she said. Samuel studied it carefully. A gravity-fed network. The spring sat above the town so the water could travel without pumps. If the map was accurate, the founders had not only donated land, they had built a system designed to keep Bellwether alive during drought. At the bottom of the box, Eleanor found a sealed letter signed by Reverend Amos Bell. Samuel read the final lines aloud. "If the official records are altered, let these papers remain where stone and faith may protect them. The land belongs to the people of Bellwether." Eleanor looked toward the opening. Victor had seen the documents. "He'll come back," she said. Samuel folded the letter carefully. "No, next time he'll bring people who can make the truth look illegal." Victor Vale returned the following morning. This time he did not come alone. A lawyer in a gray suit stood beside him, holding a leather folder. Behind them waited two county workers and Sheriff Danner, a broad-shouldered man who avoided looking directly at Eleanor. Victor removed his gloves slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you discovered some old church materials." Eleanor stood at the top of the stone steps. Samuel remained inside, with the metal box hidden beneath a canvas sheet. "I discovered documents on my property. Documents that may belong to the county," the lawyer said. "Or to the Vale family," Eleanor replied. Victor's expression hardened for only a moment. Then he smiled. "Old maps and church ledgers are rarely reliable. Paper decays. Memories become confused. It would be unfortunate if you created false expectations in a town already struggling." He offered to buy St. Agnes for $5,000. The amount was more money than Eleanor had seen since Thomas died. For one dangerous second, she imagined what it could give her: a warm room, food, safety, and freedom from another fight. Then she remembered the names in the ledgers: widows, laborers, farmers, families who had lost wells, orchards, and homes. "No," she said. Victor increased the offer to $10,000. Eleanor refused again. The lawyer opened his folder and produced a notice claiming that the church was structurally unsafe. Until an inspection could be completed, no documents were to be removed from the site. Sheriff Danner finally looked at her. "You should cooperate, Mrs. Whitmore." "With whom?" Eleanor asked. "The county or Mr. Vale?" No one answered. By afternoon, rumors had spread through Bellwether. Some residents called Eleanor a thief who had invented the discovery to demand money. Others said she was an outsider trying to steal land from families who had owned it for generations. A brick shattered one of the remaining windows that night. Wrapped around it was a note: "Take the money and leave." Eleanor found Samuel standing beside the broken glass. "They'll keep pushing," he said. "Then we stopped keeping this secret." The next morning, Eleanor carried copies of several ledger pages into the diner. She placed them on the largest table and invited anyone to read them. At first, only 3 people came. Then 9. Then more than 30 crowded into the room. An elderly woman found her father's name beside an orchard marked as transferred after his death. A retired teacher recognized signatures that did not match old-school records. A farmer traced a blue water line directly beneath land his family had been forbidden to irrigate. For the first time, Victor Vale was no longer facing one homeless widow. He was facing a town beginning to remember what had been taken from it. By the end of the week, the diner had become Bellwether's unofficial archive. Residents brought old deeds, tax notices, family Bibles and photographs stored for decades in attic boxes. The papers did not prove everything, but together they revealed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Boundary lines had moved. Names had disappeared. Dates had been altered. Still, Victor Vale's lawyer insisted the church documents were unofficial and therefore worthless. Eleanor knew they needed physical evidence. The hand-drawn map showed 3 stone markers beginning behind St. Agnes and continuing toward an abandoned orchard north of town. If those markers still existed, they could confirm the original boundaries and perhaps the underground water system. Samuel led Eleanor and Ruth Calder, a retired history teacher, through the overgrown cemetery. The first marker was buried beneath ivy near the church wall. After an hour of digging, they uncovered a flat stone carved with a cross and the letter A. The second stood beside a dry creek bed, almost hidden beneath a fallen oak. The third was missing. Without it, the line could not be completed. For 2 days, volunteers searched the field. Victor's men watched from trucks parked along the road, but no one interfered. On the 3rd morning, a young farmer named Daniel Ortiz noticed that the grass in one narrow strip remained green despite weeks without rain. The line led toward a cluster of thorn bushes at the edge of the old orchard. Beneath the roots, they found the 3rd stone. Samuel pressed his ear to the ground. "Do you hear that?" At first, Eleanor heard nothing. Then came a faint movement beneath the soil. Running water. The group cleared the brush and discovered a collapsed stone channel. When Daniel removed several packed branches, cold water burst through the gap and spilled across the dry ground. Within minutes, a shallow stream was running downhill. Ruth compared the locations with the old map. The markers matched. The channel matched. And the boundary line placed the spring, orchard, and nearly 40 surrounding acres inside the original public trust. Sheriff Danner arrived shortly after noon. This time, he was accompanied by a state surveyor and a records investigator from outside Bellwether. The surveyor examined the carvings, measured the distances, and studied the water channel. "These are not decorative stones," she said. "They are historic boundary markers." The investigator held up one of the Vale deeds. "And this description conflicts with them." Victor Vale stood silently near the road. For the first time, he had no offer, no warning, and no lawyer speaking for him. Eleanor looked at the water moving through the field. The truth was no longer trapped inside a metal box. It was flowing where the whole town could see it. The investigation lasted 6 months. During that time, the state froze several Vale property transfers and reviewed decades of county records. Some deeds were declared invalid. Others required further hearings. Victor Vale resigned from the local development board before charges of fraud and document tampering were formally filed. But Bellwether did not wait for the courts to rebuild. The newly confirmed public trust included St. Agnes, the spring, the abandoned orchard, and 42 acres of surrounding land. A temporary council was formed to manage the property, and Eleanor was asked to serve as its chair. She refused at first. "I bought a broken church," she said. "I didn't come here to run a town." Samuel smiled. Maybe the town needed someone who didn't come here for power. On the first Saturday of spring, more than 80 people arrived at St. Agnes, carrying ladders, paintbrushes, tools, and baskets of food. Farmers repaired the roof. Retired carpenters rebuilt the damaged pews into tables and shelves. Teenagers cleared brush from the old water channels. Children planted beans, potatoes, and apple saplings in the restored orchard. No one asked Eleanor where she had come from anymore. They simply asked what needed doing. The main hall became a community kitchen and meeting space. The former vestry was turned into a small medical room for visiting nurses. One side chamber became a library stocked with donated books. Cots were placed in the basement for families needing temporary shelter during winter. The spring water was tested and approved for agricultural use. Stone channels carried it toward the community gardens, where vegetables began growing on land that had remained dry for years. By late summer, the first harvest filled the church with baskets of tomatoes, squash, beans, and apples. Eleanor stood beneath the restored beams as families moved around her, laughing and sharing food. For decades, St. Agnes had been treated as a ruin. Now its doors remained open every day. One evening, Samuel helped Eleanor place a small brass plaque beside the repaired altar. It read, "This land belongs to those who care for one another." Eleanor touched the words gently. She had arrived in Bellwether with one suitcase and nowhere to live. Now the old church held a room for her behind the library. But the greatest change was not that Eleanor had found a home. It was that the entire town had found one with her. 1 year after Eleanor first arrived in Bellwether, the bell of St. Agnes was ready to ring again. The restored church stood beneath a clear autumn sky. Beyond its open doors, water moved quietly through the old stone channels, feeding the orchard and community gardens. Inside, the altar had been repaired, but Eleanor had asked the workers to leave one thin crack visible across the white stone. Samuel had questioned her decision. "After everything we did, why leave it broken?" "Because it was broken," Eleanor said, "and pretending otherwise would erase the reason we saved it." Near sunset, the people of Bellwether gathered outside the church. Eleanor climbed the narrow bell tower stairs with Samuel behind her. At the top, she wrapped both hands around the old rope. For a moment, she thought of Thomas. She remembered the house they had lost, the walnut clock he never repaired, and the coat she had carried onto the bus because it still smelled faintly of him. "I thought losing that life meant mine was over," she said. Samuel looked down at the people filling the churchyard. "Maybe it only meant you had somewhere else to be." Eleanor pulled the rope. The bell rang for the first time in 30 years. Its sound rolled across the orchard, the fields and the streets of Bellwether. Conversations stopped. Children looked up. Elderly residents closed their eyes, as if recognizing a voice they had feared they would never hear again. Eleanor listened until the final note disappeared into the evening air. Later, after everyone had gone, she returned to the altar alone. The hidden chamber beneath it was empty now. The ledgers, maps, and Reverend Bell's letter were displayed where anyone could read them. Nothing remained buried. Eleanor placed her hand over the narrow crack. What had been concealed beneath the altar was more than evidence of stolen land. It was a promise that Bellwether had forgotten. The wells would serve the thirsty. The orchards would feed the hungry. The church doors would remain open to those with nowhere else to go. That promise had waited beneath stone for generations. It had not been uncovered by someone wealthy or powerful. It had been found by a 61-year-old widow with one suitcase, no home, and $300. Eleanor looked across the quiet church. She had come to Bellwether believing she needed a place to hide from the end of her life. Instead, she had opened a door, and an entire town had walked through it with her.